Hi guys, how you doing? I just wanted to do a quick video just to give some advice, I guess, on some people have been asking me about traveling home to the Philippines this Christmas and whether it's safe to do so and what are the advantages and disadvantages. Let me start by saying I've heard the news today that travel to the Philippines will be allowed from December the 7th. And this is for Filipino citizens, for former Filipino citizens, and for foreigners who are married to Filipinos as long as the Filipino is going home at the same time. So it still means that foreigners alone who maybe have a Filipino girlfriend and they want to see them at Christmas, obviously they still can't go. The Philippine government hasn't actually given permission for them to enter the Philippines at the moment. But for those who are former Filipinos, if you like, balik bayan, and those who don't have Filipino citizenship anymore, but were once a Filipino, yes, they can go home from December the 7th. Now, before people start rushing to book their flights and everything else, I think people need to understand the complications and people need to understand the difficulties surrounding going home at Christmas. Number one, we don't know if the lockdown will become worse, if it will change, if the rules will change in the Philippines. If, for example, there is a sudden surge of infections or more people are diagnosed with COVID-19, then of course the issue is the restrictions might become tighter. So you might travel out there, say mid-December, and it might come towards the end of December or the beginning of January, and restrictions in the Philippines might become tighter. Number two, if you travel to the Philippines with a Middle Eastern airline, Qatar, Etihad, Emirates, or any of the big airlines, you have to have one of these COVID tests before you board their plane. Now, if you go to any clinic in London to have this particular test, the test is going to cost you £130 for that test. Now, of course, when you arrive in the Philippines, you'll then have to have another COVID test. If you're an OFW, i.e. you're working abroad on some kind of work contract, then of course your hotel accommodation and that test will be free. However, if you are, say, a former Filipino citizen or a British citizen going home with a Filipina, i.e. you take balik bayan status, the issue is that when you arrive in the Philippines, you'll have to pay for that COVID test in the airport. And not only that, you need to pay for hotel accommodation because, of course, you're still quarantined until you got a COVID negative test. Yes, of course, COVID negative tests in the Philippines right now are taking a day or maybe 2 days, but people have to understand that if everybody is rushing to go home at Christmas, i.e. there's a surge of people going home, that might change and it might therefore take longer to get that COVID negative result. And bearing in mind that these hotels are maybe $100 a night or whatsoever, and you maybe have to spend 3 nights. So far you have to pay for a COVID test in the UK if you travel with a Middle Eastern airline. You then have to pay for a COVID test in the Philippines, that's £230. You then maybe have to pay for 2 nights hotel accommodation at $100 each. That's maybe £400, if not £500, depending on how long you actually don't get the COVID result. And then, of course, when you're in the Philippines, you need to observe the local laws on quarantine, the local laws on where you can visit, etc. And of course, in your particular area, if you're in your barangay, can I have the chance to go home with a British passport? DJ Her Escobar asks. Yes, from December the 7th, as far as I understand, as long as you are a former Filipino citizen, you will be able to go home to the Philippines. But if you watch back the whole of this video, you will see there are a number of complications and a number of issues. And also, advice from the British Embassy, or at least the British government, is only to go abroad if it's essential travel. Now, seeing relatives back home in the Philippines is probably not essential travel. When you go abroad to the Philippines, I would strongly suggest that you get travel insurance. And what you probably don't know is, if you are only allowed to travel abroad if it's essential, a travel insurance won't cover you. Therefore, if you get sick, you're not going to be covered. If you have accidental cancellation or some kind of problem, you're not going to be covered. And also, you're not going to be covered for COVID. So if you get COVID in the Philippines, you may be a British citizen, you may have your NHS and everything else. But if you get COVID in the Philippines, it's going to cost you thousands and thousands of pounds for treatment. And people need to understand this. I'm not saying don't go home for the Philippines. I'm just being honest with people. And the issue is, of course, when you come back to the UK, because you've been to one of the countries that's not on the travel quarantine, I'm not dual citizen, sir. Is it because they said not British passport? No, if you read the latest data that came out today, the latest advice in the Manila Bulletin, British passport holders can go to the Philippines from December the 7th. If they were a former Filipino citizen, they are allowed to go. But the situation is there's a lot of restrictions in place. There's the quarantine facility. There's the quarantine when you get to the Philippines. You have to self-quarantine. Also, when you leave the Philippines and return to the UK, you must also self-quarantine for 14 days. And then, of course, when you're in the Philippines, before you leave the Philippines, you then need another COVID test if you're going to travel on a Middle Eastern airline. So not only do you have a COVID test when you arrive in the airport, you also need to get another COVID test when you Jonathan. So basically, Jonathan, from December the 7th, former Filipinos are allowed to go home to the Philippines, as belit by Anne. So you said if you look at the Philippine directives, you'll see otherwise. That's not correct. I can tell you now, Jonathan, if you look at the advice today, if you are a former Filipino citizen and you were going home on Balit Bayan status, you are allowed to go home to the Philippines from December the 7th. But the problem is there's a lot of costs involved. So as I said, you've got to pay if you're a Filipino citizen or a former Filipino citizen going home to the Philippines from December the 7th, you have certain costs. One of them, as I said, is a COVID test. To get on a Middle Eastern flight, you have to have a COVID test at a private clinic. That will cost you £130. When you arrive in the Philippines at the airport, you also need to have another COVID test. That's going to cost you another £130. When you arrive in the Philippines, you need to have a COVID test at the airport. That's going to cost you another £80 to £100. That's £230. You're going to need 2 nights hotel accommodation minimum. That's going to cost you another £200. That's £430. If you're traveling back by a Middle Eastern airline, you need to have another COVID test at a private facility in Manila, bearing in mind there's a week's wait, sometimes another week's wait. That's another £100. So you're talking about £500 or £600. Not only that, your insurance is going to be a lot more expensive. Maybe your whole thing will cost you £600. Then talking about your flights, because everybody. Okay, sorry, Jonathan. So there are a lot of costs involved. You know, I know that people want to go home for Christmas, but also if there's a rush of people going home for Christmas, this may lead to further infections, and this may mean that when you're in the Philippines already, maybe they might change the lockdown rules and you might be stuck there. Don't forget, there's a lot of Brits who've been stuck there now for 8 months who can't leave the Philippines due to no flights, due to COVID regulations, etc. And there are people stranded who run out of money. So I'm not saying don't go home, but what I am saying is before you consider going home to the Philippines, you have to understand the whole situation. I suggest you contact the Philippine Embassy. I suggest you look on the gov.co.uk website. You must listen to the advice of the British Embassy in Manila. It's probably best to check with the airline. It's probably best to check the latest rules on the Bureau of Immigration website in the Philippines. And you need to look at all these things very, very carefully before you consider going home to the Philippines. And also, don't forget, the costs of flights are rising every day. Now people know that they can go home for Christmas. Already the flights are 1,300. Not only that, expect cancellations, expect problems traveling, expect problems going back. So just because this has been relaxed doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good idea to go home for Christmas, because each passenger will have about £500 worth of costs on top of their flight, which is £1,300, and it's rising every day. So for one person to go home for Christmas might cost them as much as £2,000. And not only that, when they come to the UK, they have 14 days compulsory quarantine. So if they're hoping to leave on December the 20th and come back on January the 3rd, and then they think they're going to go back to work on January the 4th, that means they'll be breaking the law and are subject to a heavy fine. So this is exactly right. So the fact is, you've now got, if you were supposed to come back to work on January the 4th, don't forget, you can't go back to work until January the 18th. So that's something worth looking at. Jonathan, people have to consider the amount of leave they have been given from their workplaces. And to be honest, it's not worth returning home to the Philippines unless you're going to stay for 2 or 3 weeks. I completely agree with you on that point, Jonathan. If you're thinking about, say, going home on December the 20th and you're thinking about coming back on January the 3rd, you're already talking about 2 weeks. Not only that, you have to realise that 3 or 4 days at least of your trip would be stuck in quarantine, or at least you have to stay in your hotel. Not only that, I guarantee you this, it will be so busy if people are thinking about travelling on December the 21st, December the 22nd. I guarantee you this, it will be so busy that I don't think you'll have any chance of getting your COVID-19 test results until maybe the 24th. And then you know how busy already it is to travel home to your provinces over the Christmas period. And bearing in mind it'll be hard to get transportation, bearing in mind the buses might not be running, bearing in mind there'll be social distancing. For example, if you travel on a bus in the Philippines when it's very, very busy, they're only using every other seat. So when I went at Christmas and I was going from, say, Manila to Dagupan, I had to wait maybe hours to get a bus, and then that bus was full. But what you have to consider is this, that if all of the buses are only at half capacity, you're going to be waiting even longer. So I think, in my honest opinion, and this is what I've said for the last few months, I don't think it's advisable to travel home for Christmas. I'd even go so far as saying, I think it will be reckless. Although you want to see your family in the Philippines, if you've only got 3 weeks annual leave and you want to leave on December the 21st, come back on January the 4th and start work on January the 6th, it's not actually possible, because you have to factor in the 14 days quarantine, which you must observe, otherwise you'll be fined. So unless you've got 5 or 6 weeks spare, unless you can afford to take the risk of being stuck in a hotel in Manila on Christmas Day and not even seeing your family in Christmas. And not only that, the issue is that in January, you don't even know if you can get back. There'll be lots of flights cancelled. There'll be flight changes. The costs will go up. You know, realistically, I don't think it's safe. I don't think it's a good idea, and I don't think a sudden influx of thousands of passengers into the Philippines over Christmas is a really good idea in terms of lockdown, in terms of travelling from the airport, in terms of transiting in the Middle East, in terms of getting on planes. Don't get me wrong, of course flying is safe. You know, flying is safer to get on an aeroplane than it is to get on a bus. But for those people who are saying to me that they want to travel home for Christmas, I really don't think it's a good idea. And bearing in mind the advice of the UK government is only to travel if absolutely essential, and going home to see your relatives in the Philippines is not essential, and bearing in mind you wouldn't get travel insurance. Now, that's great. Maybe you don't always need travel insurance, but please bear in mind, if you get sick in the Philippines, you're going to be spending £1,000 a night if you need intensive care. You've got to be honest. You've got to look at the costs. I wouldn't advise it. I would suggest that people would wait maybe to the middle of next year until the pandemic is either over or until there is less risk. I think going to the Philippines right now just for a holiday, just to see your loved ones at Christmas, I think is probably reckless, to be honest. Let's just look at this. Melinda said going home to the Philippines is not easy. Best not to travel. The airline ticket is double the price. My boss said he's hoping to travel next year. Yeah, that's exactly right. I wouldn't advise it this year. I don't think it's safe. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think you're helping your relatives either. I just think it's absolutely reckless. But if you do go, bearing in mind, if you don't follow the quarantine advice, you can actually get a massive fine. I think it's £10,000 or £30,000. So again, if you're thinking about travelling home for Christmas, I really wouldn't advise it. What's this? This is just my personal opinion, you know. Nobody's paid me to make this video. I don't work for any travel agency. But having been to the Philippines over 60 times, understanding the pandemic, understanding the latest regulations, I just don't think it's a good idea. Anyway, that's my advice. Thanks, guys.